Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
You know those moments when time slows down, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in that strange, heavy-limbed kind of silence where even the clinking of glass sounds like an earthquake? That's exactly how it felt in that reception hall when my brother stood up from his chair, still clutching his wine glass like it was the only thing holding him upright, and started tapping the side of it with a butter knife like he was about to deliver a best man speech in a romantic comedy. I'd been watching him out of the corner of my eye all evening, noting the way he'd refilled his drink a little too often, the way his voice got louder as the room got softer, the way his smile tightened with every kind word someone said about me. And deep down, I knew he couldn't help himself. He was always going to find a way to make the evening about him. The music had just faded into a mellow background hum, the last of the dinner plates had been cleared, and Liam and I had just leaned in for what was probably our first quiet moment alone since the ceremony ended when Jake pushed back his chair with a scrape that turned a few heads. He held up his glass and said, "If I could have everyone's attention for just a second," and there it was, the beginning of the unraveling. At first, people turned toward him with polite interest, expecting a toast, a memory, maybe a heartfelt story from childhood to wrap the evening in some nostalgic warmth. I even smiled for a second, foolishly thinking maybe he'd surprise me, maybe he'd swallow whatever bitterness he'd been nursing for years and finally offer a gesture of decency. But the moment he started speaking, I felt it. That tension just under my skin, the drop in my stomach, the subtle shift in energy that only happens when you know something is about to go very wrong. "To my sister," he said, raising his glass higher, voice slurring ever so slightly, who always had everything handed to her. "Cheers to a lifetime of getting her way." The words didn't just hit, they thudded into the air like a body hitting the floor. People froze mid-sip, conversations halted mid-sentence, and I could feel the air leave the room in a wave. A few guests laughed nervously, unsure if it was a joke or if they'd misheard. But I didn't laugh. I sat there, stiff as stone, eyes locked on him, heart pounding beneath my dress in a rhythm that didn't feel like celebration anymore. I could hear my mother's sharp intake of breath from 2 tables over, her hand flying to her mouth like that would somehow stuff the words back in. My father was staring at Jake with wide eyes, clearly realizing too late that letting him near an open bar was a terrible idea. And me? I didn't speak. I didn't move. Because I knew better than anyone that this wasn't about the wedding. This was about every year leading up to it, every unspoken grudge, every warped story he'd been telling himself to justify his resentment. This was years of jealousy disguised as humor, bitterness dressed in a pressed suit and an open bar tab. And just when the silence had stretched so long it felt unbearable, Liam stood up. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look at me for permission or guidance or reassurance. He simply placed his napkin down, lifted his own glass, and in the calmest, most disarming tone I've ever heard, said, "Funny, because we paid for your entire flight and hotel." It landed like a slap across the room, clean, undeniable, and humiliating in the kind of way that couldn't be softened or explained away. There was a half-second of stunned silence, and then the audible gasps rippled through the tables like dominoes. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Someone at the next table actually dropped their fork onto their plate with a loud clatter that seemed to echo across the whole space. And Jake, my brother, the one who'd always walked into every room like he owned it, went pale. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. His jaw twitched like he was about to form some kind of comeback, but there was nowhere for it to land anymore. I didn't look away. I didn't blink. I just sat there, smiling. Not a fake, forced smile, not the kind I'd practiced for years when I had to swallow his jabs in front of family and pretend it didn't sting. This was something quieter, something colder, something earned. Because I knew something that no one else in the room did yet, this wasn't the end of the story. This wasn't even the biggest reveal of the night. This was just the first crack in the mask. I watched Jake slowly sit back down, his glass still raised awkwardly in his hand, and I wondered if he'd even remember saying those words tomorrow morning. But even if he didn't, the people in that room would. The look on my husband's face, the calm, measured fire in his eyes, made it crystal clear to everyone watching that this wasn't just some petty family squabble. This was a line drawn in the sand. This was a message, not just to Jake, but to every person in that room who had ever mistaken my silence for weakness, my success for luck, my strength for entitlement. And the best part? I hadn't said a single word. But I would. Oh, I would. Because Jake had no idea that the worst part wasn't what had just happened in front of 200 wedding guests. The worst part was still sitting in the envelope he hadn't opened yet. If you've ever been the second child, especially the quiet one, then you probably already know what I'm about to say without needing me to say it. You know what it feels like to stand in a room full of your own family and feel like a shadow. You know what it's like to work hard, to do everything right, to follow every rule and meet every deadline, only to be met with a shrug while someone else gets a standing ovation for showing up late and making a mess. That was my childhood in a nutshell. Not tragic, not traumatic in the obvious sense, just this slow drip kind of emotional erosion where your worth is measured only in how little trouble you cause. Jake was the golden boy from the moment he took his first breath. He was the firstborn, the big personality, the center of attention at every dinner table and family gathering. He had that kind of charm that people mistake for substance, the kind that makes adults chuckle at his mistakes instead of correcting them, the kind that turns bad behavior into boys will be boys instead of accountability. He could knock over a vase and make it sound like the vase was at fault. He could forget to study, cheat on a test, lie about it to our parents, and somehow still walk away with a pat on the back and an excuse made on his behalf before I even opened my mouth. Meanwhile, I did what I was supposed to do. I was the one who remembered dentist appointments, kept track of report cards, cleaned my room without being asked, and tried not to draw attention to myself when things got tense. I wasn't perfect, but I was reliable. I wasn't loud, but I was steady. And in a house like ours, that made me forgettable. I remember being 8 years old and winning a district-wide art contest. I came home with a certificate and a ribbon, bursting with pride, and all my mother said was, "That's nice, sweetheart. Did you help Jake with his math homework like I asked?" I remember getting straight A's for an entire semester and hearing my father say, "Well, of course she did. She's not the one we have to worry about." That's the way it was. My success was expected, background noise in a household that only paid attention to trouble, and Jake was trouble with a smile. When he got into fights at school, they said he was misunderstood. When he skipped classes, they blamed the teacher. When he failed a class altogether, they called it a fluke. And when I quietly got accepted into every honors program they offered, they didn't even come to the award ceremonies. I think I stopped inviting them after the second one, not because I didn't want them there, but because I didn't want to sit through another speech knowing they were only half listening. I figured if they weren't going to clap for me, I'd learn how to clap for myself. Jake, on the other hand, got celebrated for the bare minimum. He got his learner's permit late, failed the driving test twice, and still got a brand new car for his 17th birthday. I borrowed it once to drive myself to a college interview and got lectured for an hour about being responsible. When he got accepted into a state college with barely passing grades, there was a dinner party. When I got into my dream university on a partial scholarship, my mom said, "Well, we'll see how long that lasts." I smiled through it, nodded politely, and filed it away in the mental cabinet where I kept every small insult, every dismissed achievement, every time they chose to cheer for someone who hadn't earned it. It wasn't just favoritism, it was erosion. Over time, it chips at your sense of worth, makes you question whether excellence really matters if no one's watching. But instead of yelling or fighting or trying to prove something louder, I did what I always did. I observed. I took notes. I learned to read people better than they could read themselves. I learned how to watch without reacting, how to let them show me exactly who they were without ever tipping my hand. I became a master of small silences and strategic smiles, not because I liked pretending, but because I knew one day I'd need that skill more than I needed their validation. And that's the thing people like Jake never see coming. They spend so much time performing for attention, soaking up praise they didn't earn, that they never realize the quiet ones are actually keeping score. They think silence means ignorance, that not speaking up means you don't see what's happening. But I saw everything. I saw the cracks in his confidence, the desperate way he tried to keep up appearances, the little lies he told when he thought no one was listening. I saw the way our parents propped him up, not because he was strong, but because they were afraid of what would happen if he fell. And I saw the resentment start to grow in him, not at our parents, not at his own failure, but at me. Because it's easier to blame your sister for being successful than to admit you wasted your own chances. It's easier to say she had it easier than to acknowledge that she just worked harder while you coasted. It's easier to call her lucky than to admit she did it without help, without fanfare, without applause. That's what stood behind that toast he gave at my wedding, not humor, not a joke, not even a moment of poor judgment. It was bitterness. Bitterness wrapped in a pressed suit and a glass of wine, delivered with a smile that cracked the second my husband answered back. But what Jake didn't know, what he never even considered, is that I wasn't the same quiet little sister anymore. And he'd only just opened the door to a story he wasn't ready to hear. There's something incredibly powerful about being counted out early in the game, something strangely liberating about not being seen as a threat by the people who think they know you best. Jake always assumed I was soft, assumed I was just drifting along on some imaginary current of luck and good timing, never bothering to ask what it actually took to build a life when no one's handing you a damn thing. He thought I had it easy because I didn't complain, because I didn't make a scene, because I didn't shove my accomplishments under his nose every time we crossed paths. But what he never understood, what he still doesn't understand, is that I didn't need to brag because I was too busy building. And while he was busy burning bridges and blaming the wind, I was laying bricks, one by one, in silence. After college, while Jake was hopping between entry-level jobs he barely held onto and padding his resume with exaggerated titles that didn't mean a thing, I was working 2 shifts at a local marketing firm and freelancing on the side just to keep my head above water. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't loud about it. I just knew I wanted more than a paycheck and a pat on the back for doing the bare minimum. I spent weekends poring over business books, studying contracts, watching online tutorials until my eyes burned, and learning how the world actually works when you're not born holding a golden parachute. My apartment wasn't anything special back then. Tiny kitchen, paper-thin walls, and a bathroom sink that never drained quite right, but it was mine. I saved every spare dollar I could, skipped vacations, skipped nights out, skipped anything that didn't push me one step closer to independence. I didn't wear designer clothes or drive a fancy car. I didn't care about looking successful, I cared about being successful, and there's a world of difference between the two. Jake spent years trying to look the part while I focused on actually becoming it. I invested in my first small venture before I turned 26. Nothing huge, nothing flashy, just a small service-based side business that brought in a little income, gave me real experience, and taught me everything my overpriced business courses never did. I failed a dozen times in small ways, lost clients, misquoted projects, got burned by vendors who overpromised and underdelivered, but I learned. I learned how to negotiate, how to read people, how to navigate contracts without getting eaten alive. And every time I stumbled, I picked up more than Jake ever did when he coasted through life on charm and second chances. By the time I was 28, I'd turned that side hustle into a full-time business. I hired a team. I signed a lease on a real office space. I created systems, built relationships, established a client base that actually respected me. But I never advertised it to my family. I didn't need their congratulations or their input. I didn't want them to turn my hard-earned success into a dinner table talking point or a reason to finally acknowledge my worth. I kept it private not because I was ashamed, but because it was sacred to me, something that belonged entirely to my own effort, untouched by their past indifference. By the time I met Liam, I wasn't just independent, I was rooted. I had my own home, bought with my own savings, and not a dime of borrowed help. I had investments, retirement accounts, health insurance I didn't have to beg for. I didn't need anyone to rescue me or complete me or make me whole. I wasn't looking for someone to fix my life. I was already living it. Liam didn't come into a blank slate. He came into a life I'd built deliberately, brick by brick, while everyone else assumed I was still trying to figure things out. Jake, of course, still thought I got lucky. He couldn't imagine a version of my life where I was successful without someone handing it to me. He figured I married well, or that I was taken care of, as he liked to phrase it when talking to our relatives, as if I'd been plucked from obscurity by some fairy tale prince and delivered into stability by accident. He never once thought to ask what I'd done to get there. Never thought to wonder how many years it took me to stand where I was standing. Never even considered the possibility that I'd gotten here entirely on my own, because acknowledging that would have meant confronting his own failure, and Jake was never very good at facing mirrors that didn't flatter him. I remember a holiday dinner not long before the wedding where he said, half laughing, "Must be nice having everything fall into place for you." I just smiled and said, "Yeah, timing's everything," because what else was I supposed to say? That while he was partying his way through his 20s, I was teaching myself QuickBooks. That while he was calling Dad for another loan, I was negotiating contracts with people twice my age. That while he was spending his evenings complaining about the world being unfair, I was making sure mine didn't fall apart. No, I let him believe what he wanted to believe, because some people only see what they're capable of seeing, and Jake never saw anything beyond himself. But the truth is, I wasn't lucky. I wasn't spoiled. I wasn't handed a damn thing. I earned it all, every square inch of it, while he was too busy waiting for someone else to save him. And by the time he finally realized it, I'd already made sure there'd be no one left to catch him when he fell. People like my brother are experts at dressing failure in excuses, spinning loss into bad luck, and blaming their messes on the nearest person willing to absorb the fallout. And I think, somewhere deep down, I always knew that Jake's life wasn't as put together as he tried to make it seem. There were always little cracks around the edges, little inconsistencies in the stories he told. Little moments when the mask would slip just enough to reveal that maybe, just maybe, he was drowning and hoping no one was watching him go under. But I wasn't just watching, I was collecting every dropped piece of the narrative he'd been stitching together with duct tape and ego, and by the time my wedding came around, I knew exactly how broken his story really was. It started months before the wedding when a mutual acquaintance, a friend of a friend in the kind of casual social circle where people tend to overshare after one too many glasses of wine, mentioned, in passing, that Jake had been trying to get a short-term loan approved and had been turned down. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. Apparently, the banks weren't even entertaining his applications anymore, and his credit report had more red flags than a football field after a bad call. I didn't jump to conclusions at first, but I made a mental note, because I've learned over the years that rumors have roots, and where there's smoke around Jake, there's usually an entire wildfire behind the scenes. So I started digging, not maliciously, not out of spite, but out of the simple need to know what I was walking into before I stood up in front of 200 people and invited my family into my new chapter. And what I found, well, let's just say it was worse than I expected, but not all that surprising. Jake wasn't just behind on a few bills. He was buried in debt, credit cards maxed out to the limit, a couple of payday loans with absurd interest rates, and, most impressively, a failed business investment that he'd apparently sunk most of his last savings into without doing even a basic due diligence check. The business, some kind of app startup that promised to revolutionize digital loyalty programs, had gone under less than 6 months after launch, and Jake had tried to quietly scrub every trace of it from his resume and social media. But the internet doesn't forget, and it didn't take long to find a half-buried thread on a startup forum discussing the company's collapse and Jake's name attached to the botched rollout. He'd gone in without a real business plan, partnered with people who knew less than he did, and walked away with nothing but a bruised ego and a pile of unpaid invoices he was still trying to dodge. And the cherry on top? He'd gone to our parents again, hat in hand, asking for money. Not a small amount either. Enough to bridge the gap, he said, enough to get back on track. And when they hesitated, because even they were starting to see through the charm, he turned it around and blamed me. Claimed I was sucking up all the family attention, that they'd shifted everything toward me now, that my wedding was some kind of elaborate power play meant to push him out of the picture. It was classic Jake: rewrite the script, make himself the victim, and hope no one digs too deep into the truth, because the truth was messy and he'd never learned how to handle messy things without dragging someone else into the cleanup. I had every right to cut him off at that point. I could have disinvited him from the wedding without so much as a second thought. I could have told him directly that I knew everything, laid out every detail of his financial disaster, and forced him to face it head-on. But I didn't. Not because I wanted to spare him, and certainly not because I wanted to be the bigger person. I let him come for one very specific reason, because I wanted the unraveling to happen in front of the very audience he'd spent years trying to impress. I wanted the mask to crack in public, not behind closed doors where he could spin it later as another misunderstanding. I wanted his performance to collapse under the weight of its own fiction while the spotlight was on and the cameras were still rolling. So yes, we paid for his flight. We paid for his hotel. We made it easy for him to show up and put on his little show, because I wanted him front and center, dressed in his best suit, glass in hand, thinking he was still in control of the story. I wanted him to believe, right up until the moment Liam dropped that truth like a hammer, that he was still the one pulling the strings. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't cruel or loud or even confrontational. Sometimes it's quiet, calculated, and so precise it looks like kindness until it's too late. And the thing is, people always underestimate the power of timing. They think control is about volume or authority or dominance, but real control is about knowing when to speak, when to step back, and when to let someone hang themselves with the very rope they insisted on holding. That's what I did. I let him walk straight into the room, let him toast, let him play the part of the jealous, bitter older brother, and then let Liam deliver the first strike with one sentence that changed everything. But what Jake still doesn't know is that there's more. That envelope he was handed after the wedding? It holds a truth even louder than that toast. And he hasn't even opened it yet. People love to believe weddings are spontaneous magic, that the laughter, the tears, the perfectly timed speeches, and soft candlelight just happen to fall into place like puzzle pieces. But anyone who's planned one, really planned one, knows better. A wedding is choreography. It's strategy disguised as celebration. Every chair placement, every moment of silence before the music swells, every toast, every floral centerpiece, every flickering votive on the table is designed to say something without saying it out loud. And mine, well, mine was a message. A message not just to celebrate love, but to draw a line so sharp it couldn't be smoothed over later with apologies or excuses. Because this wasn't just about vows and first dances and cake tears. This was about something much older, something much heavier, something that had been building under my skin for years while the people around me clapped for the wrong characters in my story. When Jake walked into that reception hall, he thought he was just attending a wedding. He thought he was just showing up to play his role, say a few charming things, drink on someone else's dime, and maybe, just maybe, steal a little of the spotlight for himself. What he didn't know was that every detail in that room had been designed to trap him, not cruelly, not maliciously, but with a precision that only comes from years of knowing exactly who you're dealing with and exactly how far they'll go if you just give them the stage. I'd spent weeks curating the guest list, not just with friends and family, but with people I knew would notice the cracks, people who had always suspected something wasn't quite right with Jake, but never had the context to say it out loud. A few old family friends who remembered how many times Jake borrowed money he never paid back. A former coworker who'd been burned by one of his half-baked business deals. A cousin who used to idolize him but had recently started asking more pointed questions about his career changes. I knew who would watch closely, who would whisper after dinner, who would carry the story long after the last slice of cake was eaten. Because when a person like Jake falls, it's not just the fall that matters, it's who's there to see it. I told the MC privately to let Jake speak early in the evening, before too many drinks had dulled the room's attention, before the music got too loud for people to hear clearly. I didn't tell Liam in advance exactly what Jake might say, but I didn't need to. Liam had watched this dynamic unfold quietly for years. He knew the tone, the bait, the look Jake got when he thought he was being clever. So when Jake stood up with his glass, when he delivered that backhanded little toast wrapped in mock humor and subtle venom, Liam didn't flinch. He waited until the silence settled over the room like a fog and then cut through it with that one sentence, clean, precise, devastating in its simplicity. And the room changed. Not just the energy, but the shape of the night itself. It was like watching a balloon pop in slow motion, all the air sucked out of Jake's performance in an instant. People didn't need a follow-up explanation. They didn't need a slideshow of Jake's missteps or a list of his debts projected onto the wall. All they needed was that one truth, spoken calmly, spoken confidently, delivered by a man who didn't raise his voice, but raised the stakes. After the toast, I walked across the room like nothing had happened. I accepted hugs, clinked glasses, smiled for pictures. But I never let Jake out of my sight. I watched him shrink in his chair, watched him fiddle with his napkin, watched him shift in his seat while people whispered behind him, the realization blooming across the room faster than any bouquet ever could. And when the moment came, when the music swelled again and the dinner plates were cleared, I walked over to him, leaned in just enough to make sure only he could hear me, and handed him a sealed envelope with his name written neatly across the front. He didn't say anything. He didn't even reach for it right away. He just stared at it like it might bite him. But I smiled, thanked him for coming, and walked away without another word. Because that envelope didn't need an introduction. It didn't need a monologue. It was the final move in a game he didn't even realize he'd been playing, and I'd been planning it since before the engagement ring was even on my finger. Inside that envelope was more than paper. It was the consequence of every lie he'd told, every dollar he'd borrowed and never returned, every moment he stood taller than me, not because he earned the height, but because the rest of us were told to crouch down. It was the final act in a play where he always assumed he was the lead, and I was just the understudy waiting for scraps. But I was never waiting. I was writing my own script in the background, rehearsing lines he'd never hear, building a scene so sharp he'd never recover from it. And the best part? No one else in that room even needed to see what was inside. Because they'd already seen enough. The story had shifted, the roles had reversed, and Jake, golden boy, attention hog, favorite child turned family liability, was now the man who got publicly humbled in a room full of people who used to believe his narrative. And I didn't need to shout or scream or even say, "I told you so." I just needed him to open that envelope when the crowd was gone, when the spotlight faded, when he was finally alone with the weight of his own choices. That was the checkmate. And I was standing in lace and pearls, smiling. There's something strangely peaceful about letting the truth speak for itself, something deeply grounding in realizing that you don't need to shout, don't need to demand recognition, and don't need to force anyone to understand your worth once you've already embraced it for yourself. I used to think power came from being heard, from standing in the center of the room and taking up space loud enough to drown out the echoes of everyone else's opinions. But I've learned that real power, the kind that roots itself deep in your spine and doesn't flinch, is much quieter. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't need a microphone. It just waits, patiently, until the moment everyone else realizes you were never weak, you were just watching. And I watched for a long time. I watched every backhanded compliment disguised as a joke. I watched every dinner where Jake's stories were met with applause while mine barely registered. I watched every time my parents leaned toward him like gravity only worked in his direction, like their pride had a built-in compass that always pointed toward his mediocrity. I watched, and I stored every moment away, not with anger, but with clarity. Because I knew that one day, the imbalance would tip. Not because I would push it, but because it couldn't hold itself up forever. This wasn't revenge. Not really. Revenge is messy and loud and emotionally exhausting, and I've spent far too much of my life carrying the emotional weight for people who never once asked if I was tired. This was balance. This was the universe finally catching up with the storyline that had been off-kilter for years. This was about letting people feel the silence I've felt my entire life, the awkward, uncomfortable kind that wraps around you when you realize you've been wrong and you can't take the words back. I didn't want to humiliate Jake. I wanted him to sit in that discomfort long enough to recognize it. I wanted him to finally understand that not everything you've lost was stolen. Some things simply weren't yours to begin with. And yes, the envelope mattered. Not just because it was the final play, not just because it symbolized everything he hadn't seen coming, but because it held the truth in the most undeniable form possible, a legal notice, signed and sealed, informing Jake that the last asset he had left, the one he thought he could fall back on, the one lifeboat he assumed would always be waiting just in case things got worse, had quietly been sold. And I was the buyer. He hadn't lost it in a dramatic foreclosure or a public court battle. He'd lost it in silence, through a third-party acquisition I orchestrated with the same kind of meticulous patience I used to build my entire life. No fireworks, no headlines, just one clean transaction and a signature he never saw coming. It wasn't about the property itself, it was about the message. The final safety net he thought he could fall into? Gone. And I didn't even need to say a word. That's what people don't understand about being underestimated for so long. It teaches you how to work in the shadows. It teaches you how to make moves without warning, how to calculate steps that don't need validation, how to turn every insult into fuel and every dismissal into strategy. It teaches you how to sit still while the room burns and still know where every exit is. I wasn't the golden child. I wasn't the one they bragged about at reunions or posted about on Facebook. I was just the one watching, quietly, carefully, constantly. And now that the dust has settled, now that the whispers have started, now that the story has shifted and people are finally asking questions they should have asked years ago, I feel no need to correct the record. Let them wonder. Let them dig. Let them finally realize that maybe the person they ignored was the one holding all the cards. I don't want apologies. I don't need acknowledgement. I don't need my parents to finally see me, and I don't need Jake to grovel or explain. I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. I'm just free. Free from the need to prove anything. Free from the weight of always being the one who swallowed every word to keep the peace. Free from the expectation that I should be grateful for scraps while someone else gets a parade. And the best part is, I didn't take anything from Jake. I didn't steal it. I didn't sabotage him. I simply made myself ready for the moment he finally dropped what he thought he could juggle forever. And when that moment came, I was there, not to catch him, but to claim what he never knew he was holding on borrowed time. They said I always got everything handed to me. But the only thing I ever received was the burden of staying quiet. And that night, I finally handed it back.